welcome to another painting video. In this video, I'll be painting some 40k scenery. This scenery is 3D printed and the files were made by the folks over at Eons of Battle via their Patreon. I base my painting recipe on theirs, but I do things a little differently. I really like the look of the terrain and it was made with a competitive 40k in mind. Let me show you how I prepared the scenery and painted it. Let's begin, shall we? In the Leviathan tournament pack, it is recommended to set up the terrain using pieces that will represent cover. I cut these pieces out of thin MDF boards of about 3mm thick. On top of that, I added a little piece of hard foam. There are quite a lot of pieces that you need. Got 6 big ones, 2 medium ones and 4 small ones. The scenery that goes on the pieces I printed and assembled beforehand. There's quite some variety in the scenery. I'm really looking forward to paint these up. Besides the Eons of Battle scenery, I also had these buildings printed. Fun part is that one I printed myself in resin and the other was printed on a filament printer by a buddy of mine. So let's do a little comparison. First up, the resin building is way heavier. For scenery and because it's attached to the board, this might be a bit problematic. Dropping this will ruin the piece right away, I'm sure. But I must say that the detail on the resin building is a lot crisper than the filament print. The filament print shows a lot of layer lines and has some fuzzy details. There are also a lot of these little strings which still need to be sanded off. While the detail on the resin is better, the resin is very heavy and also used up a lot of resin. For scenery, it's probably better to print on a filament printer as it's lighter and cheaper. Alright, let's get back to prepping the scenery. To add some texture to the floor of the building, I draw a grid on the foam board. And this is why I added the foam board so I can easily cut out a grid on the floor. I spaced the grid about 2 centimeters apart, which I think works really nice with the buildings. I then use a knife to cut along the lines to create a pattern on the floor. I also carved in some cracks on the floor, but I forgot to film that. I glue the scenery on the board. And then I start adding some sand to the board. Just lay down some wood glue and sprinkle the sand on it. I shred some big pieces of cork to make some rubble. I also add this to the board with wood glue. I also had some basing bits from my whirly just laying around, so I decided to also add a couple of these to the boards to add more urban debris. I add more sand. Just add these to corners or where rubble would be piled up. I also add these to top floors to make sure there's rubble there as well. Finally, I go around the board with texture paste. I add it to all the borders and a little bit inside the building. It's fun to break up the tiled floor with the paste. Just add where applicable and be creative in this step. After I finish the scenery, I prime everything with black primer. These large models are better primed with a rattle can, but I did not have one, so airbrush it is. From an angle, I airbrush on Dawnstone to make the building look lighter while leaving in some shadows. The parts I want brighter, I spray with Ash Grey. You can also use Administratum Grey for this, it's the same color. To add some more contrast, I spray on Basilicanum Grey on the lower areas of the walls and floors to get some of these shadows back. With a big sponge, I apply Celestra Grey to the walls to create some texture. Just make sure there's little in the sponge and just go nuts on the walls. These walls are quite busy, so it might not be super necessary, but it does add a nice subtle effect. Now I dry brush a white paint over the entire building and raised areas on the floors. This will make all the details pop out more. I airbrush on a watered down Gryph-Charger Grey to add a splash of color to the walls. To enhance the previous step, I do the same with Drakenhof Nightshade. I started with a boring grey building, but by playing around with contrast paints through the airbrush, it creates some more interesting hues on the building. You can also experiment with other contrast paints, of course. Now let's add more color and paint to the exposed bricks. With my airbrush, I spray on a Vallejo Model Air Fire Red on the bricks. I did this mostly to practice my airbrush control, but you can also do this with a thick dry brush to achieve roughly the same effect. I then dry brush Squig Orange on the bricks and end with a dry brush of Kindleflame to highlight the bricks. I really like the design of these buildings. The bricks really add a fun splotch of color to the drab buildings. Now let's look at some more details, starting with the gold and metal parts. Everything I want brass, I dry brush with Retributor Armour. No need to completely cover everything. It's fine if the grey is still poking through. This will add to the worn effect. Metal parts are dry brushed with Leadbelcher. Because of the rough dry brush, I'm not even going to bother with washes, as it's not really necessary here. I apply some rust to the metal. Here I'm using orange rust from Greenstuff world. It's very liquid and applies easily. It darkens a little bit when drying and it gives a nice, pretty clear rust effect. At least this is good enough for scenery. I apply Nihilakh Oxide to all the brass parts. You can apply as much or as little as you want here. It's a bombed out building, it needs to look rough anyway. Even more fun spot colors on the buildings. Next, I'm taking a look at the floors. Any upper floors I have on my buildings, I spray with Vallejo model color Yellow Ochre. This will break up the big grey blob in the middle. I then spray a mix of Agrax Earthshade and Lahmian Medium on the floors to darken the edges. Any wires or tubes I find, I paint with Black Templar. And of course there are skulls. I paint these with Ushabti Bone and shade them with Skeleton Horde. To add some working red lights, I first roughly dry brush Wazdakka Red on the light and where the OSL would hit the walls. I do the same with Trollslayer Orange, but I focus more on the light and the inner parts of the OSL. With Flash Gitz Yellow, I now stipple on the paint to brighten the light. Stippling will give the light a very nice and rough texture. I repeat the previous step with Dorn Yellow. And I end with Dorn Yellow in the airbrush to really brighten the light in the center. And we're done. Here we have some really cool looking pieces of scenery. If you want these buildings, make sure to check out the Patreon of Eons of Battle. I printed 6 buildings in total to paint up in the same way, so I have my work laid out for me. Next up, I'm going to show you all how I painted up my Gore Warden, which won first place in a painting competition. In the meantime, be sure to check out my Instagram, where I'll post pictures of current projects and behind the scenes stuff. But for now, thanks for watching.